Session 2, Question and Answer Follow-Up. Some of the questions covered in this Q&A portion of Session 2 include balancing God's wrath, which seems to be so prevalent in the Old Testament, with grace. Where does one go to find commentaries that accurately deal with Old Testament passages from a redemptive historical approach? And how do you deal with the accusation that preaching Christ from the Old Testament is biblically incorrect and racially insensitive to the Jewish community?
So questions, I think most of your questions ought to be aimed at Ed and what he's already gone through, but they can be on anything. So let's go.
Professor Clowney, that stuff that you did on prayer of Moses was just fantastic. How do you go to your congregation and not give the impression that they can't exegete the Bible properly because they don't see the Hebrew the way he's done it? How do you avoid the specialist mentality that steals the Bible from the people?
It shows that they need a preacher. Job security, yeah. No, you got to be serious about that. I mean, that's why you need preaching every Sunday. You need somebody who will dig out the riches of the treasures of God and tell people about it. I know it discourages people a lot. They say, well, you find it there, but I have no clue how to find it there. Well, that's why we're here today. So we'll get more clues about how to find it as preachers. But then we have to be showing people that it's there. But there's no evading the importance of training and preparation and diligent study of the Word. So that, well, for that matter, so that you can be fresh, so that you can tell people that things they don't already know. The last thing about preaching, I mean, the worst thing it would be if it were boring, if you're never telling people anything they don't already know.
Most people on Canada would understand about the old.
Oh yeah, the wrath and the grace. Yeah. Well, I think the reason that impression is found is because the Old Testament does indeed emphasize the wrath of God in terms of the structure of the covenant. Meredith Kline, has done a lot of writing about this, and he certainly has emphasized the reality of the judgment on the people if they disobey. And, of course, that never disappears. That never disappears in the New Testament either. Here you have Jesus when he speaks, telling this story of the prince that went away to get his kingdom and then came back with the kingdom and asked the people how they had handled the investments that he had made with them, And we all talk about that and think about that wonderful thing on stewardship. But how about the end of it? Jesus says, the king will say, let my enemies be brought before me and slain in my presence. Well, but Jesus is saying this, you see. And then right across the page, he's coming into Jerusalem, and he looks at the city, and his eyes are filled with tears. If only they had known, then he would have gathered them as a hen gathers her chicks. But now the time of judgment is going to come. So, which is right? Well, in one sense, the parable is a parable. It's a story. It's not telling us everything about Jesus by any means, and you mustn't make a parable and not translate it point for point. You must see that it is a parable. But on the other hand, there's something revealed there, namely the perfect holiness of Jesus Christ, his wrath against sin, and the fact that there is really judgment, and that he is the judge. And that's something we never preach, or at least almost never. Jim Packer talks about preachers that draw people to Christ and preachers that drive people to Christ. Well, I must confess to my shame, I've always been a drawer and almost never a driver. And that's not good.
Going back to the same question that we just raised a while ago, isn't there always even in the Old Testament, something of the love of God lurking in the shadows concerning, wherever the wrath of God is expressed. And isn't there also in the New Testament a very strong warrant for the wrath of God being expressed? And I think the difficulty is perhaps our exegesis of the text in presenting the material to the congregation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Are there commentaries that are dealing with the Old Testament text in this sort of redemptive historical approach? Because you say most commentaries don't necessarily do that.
There is a real change in recent commentaries in terms of scholarly expertise. In the Word series of commentaries, for example, they're massive from the standpoint of scholarship. For every section, they give you pages of bibliography. You could prepare a doctor's dissertation on on any one of those pages just using the research that's offered to you. But the scholarship is at a new order of proficiency. But one thing that is especially good, I think, is the way in which these more recent commentaries do also give us an insight into the literary structure. Mm-hmm. Because when I went to seminary, we never studied the literary structure at all. See, we didn't even know. I never met a chiasm while I was in seminary. But at Westminster seminaries, this is the sign, you see. You find chiasms everywhere. And they are everywhere. And there's a literary intricacy that's astonishing in the Old Testament. Of course, the old Jewish commentators, they always saw that. And you read some of the Jewish commentators, and they bring out the literary structure because they catch all the puns, for example, that we tend to miss. So, and literary structure helps you because it loosens up your mind. It shows you there's more here than you thought.
For example?
Well, the one I mentioned, the chiasm in Exodus, that makes you challenge the NIV translation. You realize when you see that Moses is repeating exactly what God had said, then that is a chiasm. See, he's come back to where he started. Of course, all literary interpretation is all based on repetition. That's the great thing of it all. So you always get to be alert as to where things are being repeated and ask why and where. These new word commentaries do that all the time.
Now, is your question, though, got to do with what Ed... I see some of you already beginning to say, wow, look at the way he takes those texts apart. Are you talking about the Christocentric focus, or are you talking more about the... Okay, but you're not just talking about the way in which he interprets it, looks at it as literature and as narrative, but the Christocentric. Ed, do you feel like the commentaries, though, now, say Old Testament commentaries, are having more of a redemptive historical gist or not? I mean, do we have commentaries that we can look to for that?
Well, Childs, in his commentaries on Exodus, for example, he brings in some of that. He recognizes that. Of course, a marvelous commentary is Don Carson's commentary on the Gospel of John. There's a commentary that does everything. It gives you the Christ-centeredness always. It gives you all the background, all the information. It gives you beautiful examples of exegesis where he's worked through a problem. He's never seen a problem that he hasn't tried to solve. It's an amazing piece.
So you're saying...
Devotion, too. Devotion.
Right. So the New Testament commentaries that are really good about it you might want to look in your New Testament commentaries, look at the scripture references. Sometimes the New Testament scholars today are more sensitive to the Old Testament backgrounds, and the Old Testament scholars feel free to move forward. Have you noticed that? A lot of them, for various reasons, still are afraid of scholarly opinion. They're afraid to look forward to Christ. But I do think that the most recent commentators in the Gospels are feeling very free to look back. And they recognize the enormous number of allusions that are really there. and therefore look at the scripture reference index in the back of your New Testament commentaries when you're preaching on Isaiah or Exodus or Chronicles. I mean, we have a tendency to say, okay, I'm preaching on Chronicles, and you look at your, oh gosh, I don't have any commentaries in Chronicles. You order some, you go to the library. Maybe you better look in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all your commentaries on the Gospels, and look back for allusions to your passage on 2 Chronicles. And to your surprise, you'll find sermon-breaking, you know what I mean? Sermon-breaking comments, exegetical insights that just break open the whole thing for you as a preacher on your Old Testament text and your New Testament commentaries. I do that all the time. And then there's also even New Testament studies, like, you know, any N.T. Wright book I've got, I look at the Old Testament index to see, because he's big on that. You know, maybe too big, but he's big on finding, you know, how Christ is the answer to the Old Testament hopes, the answer to the Exodus, the exile, and so forth. So, I mean, in other words, I don't just go to Old Testament commentaries to find good exegesis, Christocentric exegesis of Old Testament passages. Otherwise, you may not find it. You're right. Because I do think Old Testament scholars are still scared. They're afraid to look forward to Christ for fear of people saying you're not, you know, well, a lot of people look at it as sort of Christian imperialism now. I fairly continually am now criticized by even non-Christians or people who come to church who don't like the fact that I use the term Old Testament and feel like it's anti-Semitic and it's you know, sort of Christian ethnocentric. You should talk about the Hebrew Scriptures and the Greek Scriptures. You shouldn't talk about the Old Testament. You shouldn't try to read. In other words, I get that all the time. Maybe if you haven't, it's because it's, I don't know, you live someplace. It'll come. and there's a lot of Old Testament scholars who are living under sort of the threat that you are being you know, sort of Christian imperialism by trying to read these Hebrew Scriptures that belong to the Hebrew people as if they're just about Jesus when they're not. So it's politically incorrect to do Christocentric exegesis at this point. Politically incorrect, I mean it.
Yeah.
And therefore, sometimes you're going to find a lot of those guys putting those commentaries out are going to be afraid to move forward. Now, if you get an Alec Matier or, you know, something like that, then they don't care. They look ahead. But does that? I mean, I hope that answers your question. I'm speaking as a practicing minister who tries to find good exegesis on Old Testament texts.
Did you hear it because there really aren't any Old Testament?
No, I'm not saying there aren't any, but you're right. You're right in saying that a lot of the most scholarly you pull a commentary, you go get 5 commentaries on Exodus, a lot of them will be afraid to look forward to Christ for those reasons, whereas find the New Testament commentators are not afraid to look back, and very often you'll do that. Like Don Carson has all kinds of great Old Testament exegetical insights if you use his index in the back of his book on John.
But even like the angels ascending and descending in the commentaries of John, that I didn't come across that until I read a book by Horton. He just referred to it, and it was revolutionary. No commentaries out there.
I don't know how you miss that. He's saying he'd never seen a commentary on John 1:51, linking that back to the Jacob's ladder, the so-called Jacob's ladder. And I don't know how you miss it, but you're right. Well, Don will do it. Okay.
D.K. Beale in his commentary on Revelation. Have you seen that one?
I know of it. No, I haven't seen it yet. I've read other things that Beale's written that are very good, though.
Yeah, he does a lot of the Old Testament allusions. He takes John apart. It's every allusion that John makes. And I'm sure that passage is in there. It's about a 1,1400 page commentary on Revelation. I think it's in the New Testament, the Greek New Testament, the Greek International Series of New Testament.
When Don Carson exegetes Jesus saying you have to be born of water and the Word in John 3, well, Carson, there's all the old questions. Is this the Catholic Baptist thing? Are we talking about water regeneration, baptismal regeneration, or what are we talking about? And he just simply says, this is Ezekiel.
Yeah, sure.
This is Ezekiel. Ezekiel is using both the image of being washed you'll be washed clean in the Spirit. And he just goes back to the Ezekiel passage. He grounds it completely in Ezekiel. And what Jesus is saying is, you're a teacher in Israel and you don't know you're Ezekiel?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, so what Don just does is he he says, these folks, this is the Bible, don't forget. The Old Testament, it's unfair to call it the Old Testament in one sense. This was Jesus' Bible. So,
yeah, I was thinking, isn't it easier for the New Testament scholars to look back than it is for the Old Testament scholars to look forward? Because, the New Testament, is overladen with the early writers recognizing the deep roots in the Old Testament. And isn't it perhaps a bit unfair to expect the Old Testament scholars to look forward as much as the New Testament scholars can look back?
Well, yes, I think you're right. I think it's easier to look back with the New Testament writers than it is to look forward with the Old Testament writers. And yet, I don't think that, it's often said that you can't find a type in the Old Testament unless it's identified as a type in the New Testament. That's saying the New Testament way is the way you're sure of getting it right. But that's sort of like saying that you don't understand the math problem in the text of the book, but you can always find the answer by looking in the back of the book. I think it seems to me that you're taught also not only that they did it, but they're taught how they did it, and that's what we try to do.
That was over the years, that was a big, that was a revelation for me. I don't know if, as a Presbyterian, I'm allowed to use that word, but that when I don't know quite when the penny dropped. Over the years, I had Ed Clowney sort of as my teacher, though I never paid him a cent of tuition. But because I went to a different seminary, than Westminster. But over the years, at some place he said that. He said, when the New Testament writer, exegetes Psalm as the prayer of Jesus, is he teaching us not only that Psalm X can be interpreted as a prayer of Jesus, but he's also teaching us how to read the Psalms? I mean, are we not allowed to learn anything about reading the Old Testament from him? Do we have to say, it's so utterly mysterious, the method is so utterly mysterious, so completely de novo divine? God said to Matthew, that verse is about Jesus. Okay, Lord, and he wrote it down. And therefore, there's no way for us to learn from the example, but only from the actual, only from the final product, but not from how he exegetes. And I think actually that's almost a superstitious attitude, as if it was just so completely divine. Why can't we see that what they assumed? Why can't we learn not only what they actually said in this instance, but how they studied the Scripture? And that was actually a very big revelation for me. That freed me up. And that's the reason why people will say, sure, we're allowed to preach Jesus the Passover Lamb because the New Testament says that the blood on the doorpost represents Jesus. But we're not allowed to preach, Abraham offering Isaac up as the father offering up the son, because there's no New Testament spot that explicitly says so, even though the fact is that, some of your commentaries are going to say there are allusions. There are allusions out there. But since there's no place that says that where one of the New Testament writers says Isaac is a type of Christ, we mustn't preach it that way. And Ed freed me up when he said we have to learn from how they exegeted the Old Testament, not just what they were saying in that particular instance. That was a very big revelation for me.
Herman Ritterboss pointed out something that's I think very profitable for us to understand, namely that where did the New Testament writers get their understanding? Now think about that for a minute. Well, you say by inspiration, yes, but how did it work? When did it happen and how? Well, Jesus was with them for 40 days after the resurrection, so they no doubt knew about what he had taught on the road to Emmaus, but where did they get the rest of it? Jesus couldn't teach them much in the space of 40 days. He wasn't with them the whole time. He was only with them in certain episodes and so on. Right. So where did they get it? And the answer is, obviously, the Old Testament. So the whole New Testament grew out of the Old Testament. What was the book they were preaching? Paul went into the synagogues. What did he have? Well, the Scriptures, the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures. And so that's what he preached. That was the evangelistic tool of the the great sweep of the Christianity across the Roman Empire.
I mean, you still get, I think, I heard Don do this over in Britain. I don't know if he's written it someplace. But, for example, when God speaks out of heaven and says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased," if the apostle, this is what Don said. Now, you can go press him on this. He says, there you actually had an astounding coming together of two themes of the Old Testament. Because "in whom I'm well pleased" is an allusion, probably, to the servant, to the suffering servant. Illustrate, the suffering servant language. This is my servant whom I'm well pleased. Whereas the beloved Son, this is my Son, is the mighty King of who I'm appointing in Psalm 2. And what you have, of course, in the Old Testament is a problem, which is you've got this great mighty warrior person who's coming to put things right, and you've got this weak suffering servant person who's coming to set things right. And God essentially interprets the Hebrew Scriptures for us and says, this one fulfills all of those seemingly disparate themes in the Hebrew Scriptures right here. He's the guy. So there you have at baptism even God expounding the Hebrew Scriptures in a Christocentric way. How do you like that? You like that? But I mean, you shouldn't surprise you, because Matthew, Mark, the people who are recording these things were so absolutely immersed in it. So it should be more organic for us to put it all together, because they put it all together. They utterly put it all together, even though it's not politically correct to do so now. By the way, you can go back to anything that Ed has already said, but you can also talk about anything I said too, if you want. Yes, here?
How do you respond when somebody says this is raised the politically incorrect way?
Well, I'm careful. It's different. Manhattan is 23% Jewish, whereas the country is about 1.3% or something like that. And we don't do it. I'm in a slightly different place. I don't want to. I don't want to push you on this. I'm just showing you that in the high. What am I looking for? In the rarefied air of the scholarly world, there are influences that a scholar might feel who's going to the Society of Biblical Literature and places like that, and that none of the rest of us would feel. But I sense a little bit of it in New York City. There's an unhappiness on the part of a lot of really great Jewish scholars over feeling like our scriptures are being hijacked from us, and there's a real unhappiness about it, feeling like you're not really listening to the text, and I want to be, since I always have a fairly high percentage of non-Christians in every one of my services, and because a lot of those non-Christians are Jewish, I'm actually somewhat careful too. That's all. I mean, but I don't think we should be. In no way do I think we should defer kowtow to it at all. But it's considered racially insensitive. I've gotten that from people saying that the way you're interpreting Isaiah is racially insensitive.
And then what do you say?
What do I say?
Yeah.
Well, I say, you know what? Christianity and Islam and Judaism all have grown out of the roots of that scripture. I said, you cannot, be imperialistic backwards. I said we are all people of the book, and we all look to Abraham as our father. And it's not right for the Jews to say only, he's our father, he's not your father. Well, even the Muslims say Abraham is our father. And so what I do is I turn it. In other words, if I'm doing apologetics at this point, I'm taking their own worldview and using it against them and saying you're being ethnocentric at this point. If you say here are three major groups of people who all see Abraham as their father, and for you to say no, he's ours, not yours, it might be just as insensitive, don't you think? So let's cool it. That's all. All you're trying to do is get a little bit of room, trying to get a little bit of space, and that's all it takes, I think. So I wouldn't go too far with that. I'm not trying to say. But you never know. You might run into somebody who says that your use of the Old Testament is racially insensitive to Jews and so on. It happens to me with some regularity. That's because of where I am.